All right, so I'm going to explain to you about pedigrees. So a pedigree is basically just a family tree, but it's showing genetic traits in that family tree. So when we see the shapes and stuff, whenever it's not filled in, that means that it's not affected by whatever trait we're talking about, and that could be a disease, it could be blue eyes. I mean, it could be whatever. Um, and if it's colored in, that means it is affected by whatever trait we're talking about. So in most cases, pedigrees are used to show you diseases. So, um, so the common ones that you would see on them is something like cystic fibrosis, which is an issue with really thick mucus. So people who have that disease, they can't transport water properly across their membranes, so like their lungs and their digestive tract, and in males, their reproductive system are impaired because the mucus is too thick. Things can't move through the way they're supposed to. And in particular, people have respiratory issues because it gets so thick in their lungs that they can't breathe. So they make machines that actually like beat on the chest of the people who were affected by that, and sometimes they just go to therapy where a person just beats on them, and that's how they loosen that mucus, and then they cough it up, and it's super gross. But that way they can breathe. So really thick mucus. Albinism, that's where you don't have any pigment in your skin. So you're super pale. You also don't have any pigment in your eyes. That's why sometimes they can appear red, because you're actually seeing the retina behind it. The eyes are not red. You're just seeing the color of the blood vessels in the back of the eye. Same thing, same reason why you see red in some pictures where the flash goes, because you can see it through the pupil, which is just a hole. Achondroplasia is dwarfism, so uh, Game of Thrones Tyrion, or everything else that actor's in. But they have a normal sized torso, but small limbs, and usually they have like a very characteristic shaped head too. So it's an issue with their long bones. Huntington's disease is a neurological disease where essentially your brain starts shrinking in on itself, and you start losing functions, like motor functions first, so you start shaking, and then eventually you can't move certain things, and then once it gets to your brainstem, it impairs your ability to breathe. Without having to think about it, or you basically you end up dying because you either go into heart or respiratory failure because it's not beating or breathing on its own. Sickle cell anemia, that's where a regular shaped red blood cell, it's usually like a little donut shape with a little dip in the middle, because it does not actually have a nucleus. So once it's mature, the nucleus is taken out, it's enucleated. And the hemoglobin, which is what the molecule that carries the oxygen, the protein that carries the oxygen, ends up sticking to itself into like a long chain. So it causes the cell, instead of being nice and pretty little disc shape, that's the perfect shape to go through all of your blood vessels. It becomes this long sickle, like the Grim Reaper. He carries a sickle, long kind of half moon shaped. That does not fit very well and gets stuck and causes all kinds of problems. Hemophilia is a disease where your platelets in your blood don't properly work. So that means that if you get a little cut or a bruise or something where you're bleeding in any way, shape, or form, your body does not have the mechanism to be able to stop the bleeding. It cannot clot. And color blindness is where you have two different kinds of color receptors in the back of your eye. One is responsible for distinguishing between red and green. So if you're not colorblind, whenever the light hits your retina, it's able to say, okay, well, that was a red wavelength, or that was a green wavelength of light that was being reflected off your eye. But if you have color blindness, it can sense that it's one of those, but it can't tell which. So the other receptor, I'm pretty sure, is blue-yellow, but that's a lot less common than the red-green version. So when we're looking at the pedigree, it's pretty simple to look at here. So if you see a vertical line going down, that means that there's babies that are being had. So those are offspring. So in this case, this couple had 3 babies. A horizontal line is like marriage or mating or something. Essentially, they are having those children. Like I said, if it's not shaded in, that means they are without the disease. If it is shaded in, they are with the disease. Squares are males and circles are females. I kind of remember that because square jaw like is a nice masculine feature, so I don't know if that really helps at all, but and sometimes you get lucky, and if it's half shaded for you, that means that that's a known carrier, which means that they are heterozygous. Remember, homozygous means they have two of the same letters, so they could be like big A, or little a, whereas heterozygous means they have one big A, one little a, or H's or S's or T's or whatever letter you want to use. And it doesn't mean they're not a carrier if they're not half shaded. That just means that you got lucky and you knew that one is a carrier. And by the way, it's called a carrier because they don't have the disease, but they can carry it to their kid if they give them that little letter. So some hints that go with this. If someone marries into a family, generally, if we're looking at like disease alleles, they're not going to have those unless you have some kind of evidence that they have to. So, for example, if someone marries into a family and they don't have the disease, but then their kid ends up having a recessive disease, then they probably did have it because they had to be able to pass it on. There's one exception to that, and we'll talk about it. And if it's a dominant disease, then we'd know if they had it because they either have it or they don't, right? Because if it's a dominant disease, they either have like a big A and then they have it, or they don't have a big A and they don't. So, so that dominant, you only need one allele to show up. So if you get that big A, that means one of your parents had to have it because you had to get it from somewhere. And if they had a big A to give you, that means they also had a disease, considering that that disease goes with that dominant allele. And then the recessive diseases, they can skip generations because these carriers, like here, see this circle, this little female here, is not affected, but her mom had it, but then her kid has it. So the only way for that to happen, for two parents who don't have a disease to have a kid who does have the disease, is for it to be recessive, because if it were a dominant disease, then she would have had to get it from one of her parents. I mean, that would be impossible for that to be her parents. But if it were a recessive disease, that means that she has the recessive trait, so she has two little A's, which means that her parents each had to give her a little A, but her parents don't have it. So because they don't have it, we know they have to have a big A. But because they had to give their daughter a little a, that means they had to both be big A, little a. So that's a nice, easy rule to remember, is that if you have a kid who has it and the parents don't, they both have to be carriers, because otherwise, where would they have gotten it from? There's the exception to that is sex-linked traits. Autosomal is when we're talking about just regular big A, little a, whatever. It's roughly half females, half males. And this is just our normal genetics that we've been doing up till we started sex-linked. So, and then sex-linked is a little bit different because males cannot have two alleles. They either have a big A or they have a little a on that X chromosome. Remember, if it's sex-linked, we're going to use X and Y. If it's not sex-linked, it's autosomal because they automatically have two of each chromosome. So sex-linked, we use X's and Y's, and the reason we do that is because the Y does not have an allele. The Y chromosome is really tiny. I don't know if you remember doing the karyotype activity, but when we matched up the X and the Y with each other, the X was a really long chromosome and the Y was a really short chromosome. So it only has basically the genes on it that males need to be male. The X chromosome has a whole bunch of important stuff on it, which is why there can be sex-linked, X-linked diseases. So females can be homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive because they do have two X's, so there's two opportunities to get that allele, whereas males are either going to be dominant or recessive. They don't have that option for the second one. So they can't be carriers because they don't have two alleles to be able to carry it. So in this case here, we see it more often in males because if a female gets one allele, then they're a carrier, which means they don't have the disease here. Whereas if a male gets one allele, then he has the disease. So we see it more often in males. That's why more males are colorblind and bald than females. So I'm going to do a new video for the practice on the second page. So if you guys have any questions, let me know.